Welcome back to Talk Tickers. We're digging into the latest earnings calls for you. And today we're looking at Altimmune, specifically their first quarter 2025 results and, well, the business update call that went with it.
Yeah, this was an interesting one, obviously the financials, but I think, the real meat was in the clinical updates. They seem very focused on what's coming up.
Absolutely. A lot riding on the next few months, it sounds like. So let's maybe start with a quick snapshot, the Q1 numbers, cash position.
Right. So they finished the quarter, March 31st, that is, with $150 million. Yeah. That's in cash equivalents, and short-term investments.
Okay, $150 million. How does that compare to, say, the end of last year?
It's actually up. They had $132 million at the end of 2024. So, yeah, an increase there.
Okay, interesting. And what about the bottom line, the net loss for Q1?
Net loss came in at $19.6 million. That works out to $0.26 per share.
And compared to last year, Q1 2024?
Better this year. Last year, Q1 2024, the loss was $24.4 million, or $0.34 per share. So improvement on the loss side.
Okay, so cash is up, loss is down slightly. Where did the extra cash infusion come from?
Well, primarily, it looks like they tapped their ATM facility, their at-the-market equity program. They netted $35 million from that during Q1 itself.
Okay.
And they mentioned they pulled in another $16 million through that same facility just since April 1st. So continuing to use that.
Got it. So equity financing.
Right.
Anything else on the financing front?
Yes. They also announced a new credit facility with Hercules Capital. So adding some debt capacity as well.
Right. Okay. So bolstering the balance sheet through a couple of routes. Good overview. Let's switch gears now, like you said, to the clinical side. This seems to be where the main focus is.
Oh, absolutely. The number one thing, the near-term focus they kept coming back to is the upcoming data readout from their IMPACT-T study.
That's the phase 2b in MASH, right? Metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis.
Exactly, MASH. And they expect that data sometime this quarter. So Q2 2025, it's imminent.
And the tone sounded, well, confident? What are they pointing to specifically that makes them feel good about this readout?
Yeah, they definitely projected confidence. They highlighted a few things. First, they brought up earlier data from their phase 1b MAZLD study.
Okay.
That study showed a dose-dependent reduction in liver fat, going up to 76.4%. They really emphasized that number, called it class-leading.
76.4% liver fat reduction. That's pretty significant.
It is. And, reducing liver fat is seen as a really crucial step. It's believed to lead towards resolving the actual disease, the inflammation, and improving the scarring, the fibrosis.
Right. So strong early signals on that key biomarker. What else?
The other big piece they focused on was how they're reading the liver biopsies in the IMPACT-T trial. They're using blinded rereads for both the starting biopsies and the end of treatment ones.
Blinded rereads, how does that work?
So basically, 3 separate independent pathologists look at each biopsy slide without knowing if it's baseline or end of treatment or placebo or drug. And then they use what's called a modal scoring approach.
Sure. Modal scoring.
Yeah, essentially, the score that at least 2 out of the 3 pathologists agree on becomes the final score. They argued this is really important.
Why is that?
Well, they pointed to other MASH trials that use this kind of rigorous multi-reader approach. And historically, those trials have shown much lower placebo response rates, particularly for the fibrosis improvement endpoint, maybe in the 7 to 13% range.
Okay. So the idea is this method cuts down on the variability and noise you sometimes see with biopsy reads, especially the placebo response.
Exactly. They believe it makes it easier to show a real drug effect, assuming it's there, by minimizing that background noise.
Makes sense. Anything else boosting their confidence?
Just study power. They mentioned they actually enrolled more patients than planned, 212 participants in total. A larger sample size, statistically increases your ability to detect a difference.
Okay. Let's talk about the IMPACT trial itself then. Who were the patients and what were the main goals at 24 weeks?
The focus was on patients who had MASH confirmed by a biopsy, and specifically those with moderate to severe scarring. That's the F2 and F3 fibrosis stages.
Right, the sort of middle to late stage before cirrhosis.
Precisely, and they set up dual primary endpoints, both measured at 24 weeks.
Dual primary, meaning they only need to hit one.
Correct. Success is defined as achieving either MASH resolution, meaning the inflammation and ballooning go away without the fibrosis getting worse, or achieving at least a 1-stage improvement in fibrosis without the MS getting worse. Hit either one, and the trial meets its primary goal.
Okay, clear. And what about secondary endpoints? What else were they looking at?
A pretty standard but important list for MASH trials. weight loss, obviously. Changes in non-invasive tests like FibroScan, which measures liver stiffness, and ELF scores, another fibrosis marker. Also that liver fat reduction, but measured very precisely using MRI, PDFF. Changes in blood lipids, cholesterol, triglycerides, and of course, safety and tolerability, how well patients handle the drug.
So let's play this forward. If they do hit one of those primary endpoints at 24 weeks, MASH resolution or fibrosis improvement, what's the big deal? Why is that timing so important?
This is where they really position pemvedutide. If successful, they claim it would be the only incretin therapy, like the GLP-1s and related drugs, to show statistical significance on these core histological MASH endpoints that quickly, just 24 weeks.
Okay, the only incretin. And then there's the weight loss aspect.
Exactly, because MASH and obesity are so intertwined, right? 80–90% of MASH patients also have obesity.
Right.
So they highlighted that pemvedutide could be the first therapy of any kind to show both that MASH efficacy and clinically meaningful weight loss at that 24-week mark.
So they're pitching it as a kind of complete solution, tackling the liver and the weight.
That's the narrative, yeah. A complete solution for MASH, addressing both the liver pathology and that underlying metabolic driver.
And how did they frame the expected weight loss? Did they compare it to anything?
They did. They said they expect meaningful weight loss, comparable to what you might see if you sort of prorated semaglutide's 72-week weight loss data down to 24 weeks.
Okay.
And they argued this isn't just a side benefit. For these F2, F3 patients, who often have other metabolic issues, significant weight loss is really important. They suggested that without it, a MAS drug might really only be suitable for the most advanced fibrosis stages.
Interesting angle. So looking beyond this Q2 data drop, what's the plan for the MASH program after that, assuming success, of course?
Well, operating under that assumption, they said they're already gearing up for phase 3. They're targeting early 2026 to actually start that trial.
Okay, early 2026. What needs to happen before then?
The key step is the end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA. They're planning for that in the fourth quarter of this year, Q4 2025.
And any hints about how that phase 3 might look? What are they thinking about for the design?
A couple interesting points. They seem strongly inclined to use the 2.4 milligram dose in phase 3.
Which wasn't the main dose in IMPACT, right? IMPACT-T used 1.8 milligrams primarily?
Correct. The 1.8 milligram dose was the focus in IMPACT. Their rationale for potentially using 2.4 milligrams in phase 3 isn't necessarily about better liver outcomes, but they expect it would give better weight loss than the 1.8 milligram dose.
Leaning into that complete solution angle again.
Seems like it. They also mentioned exploring maybe a more innovative trial design, potentially including an earlier readout within the phase 3 study itself, maybe at 6 months, alongside a later endpoint like 12 months.
Why do that?
The idea would be to potentially speed things up,
Yeah.
If they can show those rapid effects they're hoping for at 24 weeks, maybe they can demonstrate something significant earlier in phase 3 too.
Got it. Okay, but MSH wasn't the only clinical news. They also talked about expanding into some new areas.
That's right. Big news there. They're moving into alcohol use disorder, AUD, and alcoholic liver disease, ALD.
Wow, okay. Those are definitely different patient populations. When are those starting?
Soon. They plan to kick off the phase 2 trial for AUD this quarter, Q2. And the ALD phase 2 trial is slated for Q3.
Okay, can you walk us through the AUD trial design, phase 2?
Sure. It's planned for about 100 patients, running for 24 weeks. They'll use that 2.4 milligram dose again, titrating it up slowly over 8 weeks, probably for tolerability.
And the main endpoint, what are they measuring?
The primary endpoint is the change in heavy drinking days, based on patient reports using a standard method called a timeline followback. They said this aligns with FDA guidance for AUD trials.
Okay, and secondaries?
They mentioned looking at alcohol consumption using PT scans, so a more objective measure, and also weight loss.
Interesting. And the ALD trial, similar size?
Similar size, about 100 patients, but this one's longer, 48 weeks. Again, the 2.4 milligram dose, titrated.
And the key endpoint for ALD?
Here, they're focusing on the change in liver stiffness measured by FibroScan. They'll look at that at both 24 and 48 weeks. And secondary endpoints, again, include alcohol consumption and weight loss.
What's the thinking behind moving into AUD and ALD? What's the connection or the unmet need they see?
They really emphasize the lack of good options. For AUD, treatments are limited. For ALD, they said there are virtually none. And they pointed out, interestingly, that obesity is a big risk factor for bad outcomes in both conditions. Plus, many of these patients have metabolic problems, kind of like the MASH population.
So they see pemvidutide's profile fitting here too.
That seems to be the rationale. The idea that it might reduce alcohol consumption, maybe through that GLP-1 effect on reward pathways or cravings, plus reduce liver inflammation, potentially via the glucagon component, and cause weight loss.
Yeah.
It's that multi-pronged approach again.
Addressing the alcohol, the liver, and the weight.
Exactly. They framed it as potentially redefining treatment for these really serious conditions. And they threw in the statistic that ALD and MAH are the leading causes for liver transplants in the U.S. So a huge potential impact if it works.
Wow. Okay. Any other sort of differentiating points they brought up on the call?
Yeah, a couple more things. They mentioned we should expect 48-week follow-up data from the IMPACT MASH trial by the end of this year.
Okay, so extending beyond the 24-week primary endpoint data, what will that show?
Specifically looking at weight loss and those non-invasive tests, FibroScan, ELF, out to 48 weeks. They seem to suggest these markers are becoming more reliable predictors of biopsy results.
Right.
And they expect the positive signals seen at 24 weeks will likely continue to improve or strengthen by 48 weeks. So another potential data catalyst later this year.
And what about body composition? Muscle and bone health, that's a hot topic with weight loss drugs.
Yes, they touched on that. They referenced previous data suggesting pemvedutide preserves lean mass relatively well. I think the number was only about 21.9% of the total weight lost over 48 weeks was lean mass.
How does that compare?
They positioned it as better than some other GLP-1s, which have shown higher lean mass loss. And, there are concerns about fracture risk with rapid weight loss, especially in older people. So they framed this lean mass preservation as a sort of holistic benefit.
Okay. And one last clinical point, did they talk about cirrhosis, the F4 stage of MASH?
They did. They expressed strong interest in potentially treating F4 patients, specifically the earlier stage, Child-Pugh acirrhosis.
Why do they think it might work there?
They believe the combination of effects, the metabolic benefits from GLP-1 and potential direct antifibrotic or anti-inflammatory effects from glucagon might be effective even when there's established cirrhosis.
So the goal is to treat the whole spectrum.
Seems like it. Yeah. From early MASH, F0, F1, all the way through F4 cirrhosis. They mentioned planning to talk to the FDA about the path forward for the F4 indication.
Okay, let's circle back to the financials and the investor angle. That cash runway you said, $150 M, gets them into Q3 2026. How does the new credit facility play into that?
Right. The Hercules Capital facility. It adds significant flexibility.
Can you break down the structure of that facility again?
Sure. It's up to $100 million total. They got $15 million right away at closing. Another $25 million becomes available later in 2025, but it's tied to hitting certain milestones, probably related to the MASH data or trial initiations.
Okay.
Then the remaining $60 million can be drawn in 2026. Again, based on meeting further milestones and conditions.
And the terms sounded pretty good.
They highlighted them as favorable. There's an interest-only payment period initially for 24 months, potentially extendable, and importantly, no warrants attached, which investors usually like to see.
Right, no equity dilution from the debt itself. So how much further could this potentially extend their runway?
They stated that if they draw down the optional parts of the facility, it could potentially add up to another year to their cash runway. So maybe taking them into Q3 2027.
It's quite a bit of breathing room. It lets them really focus on executing these clinical plans.
Absolutely. And they did connect the dots. Their R&D spending, which was $15.8 million this quarter, down a bit from last year. They tied that directly to moving these key programs forward, especially pemvedutide and the IMPACT trial costs.
So the message seems clear. 2025 is make or break, or at least potentially transformative.
Yeah, management used that exact word, transformative. They see this combination, the IMPACT readout, kicking off the AUD and ALD trials as the critical catalyst for this year.
And partnerships. Are they waiting for a partner before moving to phase 3?
They said they're open to partnerships if the deal is compelling. But importantly, they stated it's not a requirement. They're not waiting on a partner to move ahead with phase 3 MASH or the new indications. They're prepared to go it alone if needed.
Okay. So summing up the investor pitch points, it's about the potential speed in MASH, the liver fat reduction, the weight loss combo, lean mass preservation.
Right. All those potential differentiators. Plus the expansion into IUDLD, these large unmet need areas, and also leveraging that existing safety database from their older obesity studies, which might, help streamline phase 3 design.
All right, time for our This Is Not Financial Advice segment. Just a reminder, folks, these are purely speculative thought experiments drawing on what we've just discussed. Think of it like hearing a pitch inside a hedge fund. Definitely not recommendations.
Okay, pitch idea 1. This is a volatility play, pure and simple. Focus on that upcoming Q2 MASH data. Given how much management emphasized their confidence, citing the liver fat data, the biopsy reading method, the idea would be to buy some relatively cheap, out-of-the-money call options on Altimmune stock.
When would these options expire?
You'd target an expiration date just before the window when that date is expected to drop. The goal isn't necessarily to bet on the actual outcome, which is obviously risky.
Right.
It's to capture the potential increase in the stock price and the implied volatility, the IEV, as anticipation builds towards this huge catalyst. If the market starts pricing in positive expectations based on the company's confidence, IV could ramp up. It's a bet on the pre-readout hype. Very speculative.
Got it. Betting on the buzz, not the result itself.
Yeah.
High risk.
Okay, pitch idea 2.
This one's a paired trade. It leans into that complete solution narrative for pemvedutide in MHH, the liver efficacy plus weight loss plus speed.
Okay, how does the pair work?
You'd go long Altimmune, betting on a positive reaction if the IMPACT-T data is good and the market appreciates that differentiated profile. At the same time, you'd go short a competitor in the MASH space. Which competitor?
Well, you'd have to pick one whose therapy profile might look less complete after Altimmune's data comes out. Maybe a drug that shows liver benefit, but without significant weight loss. Or maybe one whose data at 24 weeks is expected to be less impressive or slower acting.
So betting that pemvedutide steals the spotlight, relatively speaking.
Kind of. The thesis is that pemvidutide's specific combo of benefits could justify a higher valuation relative to competitors perceived as offering, let's say, a partial solution. But obviously this depends heavily on picking the right short and exactly what the data shows for everyone involved. Complex and, again, very speculative.
Definitely. So again, just thought experiments, not financial advice. Please remember that. Okay, so let's wrap up our Talk Tickers dive on Altimmune's Q1 update. The big takeaway seems to be all eyes on the very near-term IMPACT-MAGE data readout this quarter.
Yeah, that's the major catalyst. Management sounds confident they're already planning for phase 3 MASH, targeting early 2026. And alongside that, they're kicking off phase 2 trials in AUD and ALD, expanding the drug's potential significantly.
And financially, they've shored things up. Cash runway into Q3 2026, potentially longer with that new credit facility providing flexibility.
Right. They're positioning 2025 as a potentially transformative year driven by these clinical milestones.
Okay. And one last time, our standard disclaimer. Everything we talked about today is just for informational purposes based on the public call. It is absolutely not investment advice. Investing here carries substantial risk. Do your own research.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. If, and it's still an if, but if pemvidutide really does deliver on this promise of hitting MHH endpoints and providing significant weight loss and doing it quickly, how does that change the whole MHH landscape? What does a complete solution actually look like, and how might the market value it?
And similarly, if they show meaningful effects in AUD and ALD tackling the drinking, the liver damage, and the weight, what could that mean for treating those conditions where, as we heard, options are so few?
Definitely something to chew on.
Indeed. Thanks for tuning into this deep dive with us here on Talk Tickers.